offering before, just in case you don't appreciate what we have to say today. That way we get the offering before you run out the door and before we make you angry. Amen. Shabbat shalom. I was talking to Tim before the service started, and he was asking me, "Are you ready?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I'm ready." He said, "Well, knock us dead." And I said, "Well, I'd rather knock you alive." But it seems that maybe this group is a little bit, you're on the verge, but it seems like you might have came in ready. Are you ready? Amen? That's what I'm talking about. You actually sound like you're a little awake out there today. What we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at this week's Torah portion, which is what we normally do. And yet I found that the more I look at these portions, the more and more they have to do with us today. We can look at it from the viewpoint that, well, that was in the past, and that really doesn't affect me. It doesn't really affect where I am today and what's going on in my life. But I found that the more and more we look into these portions and we dig into the Hebrew language, the more and more you'll find that he's actually speaking directly to you. I don't know what you may be going through, but he does, and I found that he's capable and willing each and every week to speak directly into your life, a word that can change your circumstances. How many of you believe that? If you don't, then you shouldn't be here. You're in the wrong place, is my opinion. I want to be somewhere that whatever is going to be spoken in my life, I know that it's directly from Yahweh, and it's going to change my circumstances, amen, for the better. You be the head and not the tail. And this week, we're going to take a look at this week's Torah portion, as we said, and it's titled Toldot. And if James can get the notes up for me, hopefully you'll be able to follow along, and it'll be a little bit easier. How many of you have read this Torah portion? Uh-oh. A few of you have. Well, it's a very familiar portion because we find that it covers Genesis chapter 25, verse 19, to chapter 28, verse 9. And it's picking up the narrative after the death of Abraham. And we find that it now switches the focus to Isaac. Isaac is the next leader, the next forefather of the nation of Israel. But if you've read the portion, you know that immediately it seems to switch. Not a lot said about what Isaac does as the leader of the family. We don't really get as much of a view into his lifestyle as we did Abraham or as we do his son Jacob. In fact, it seems to quickly switch, and the focus is put on the birth of his two sons, Jacob and Esau. And we find that today we can still see the same things going on that was taking place in this Torah portion, don't we? We still see Jacob and Esau at odds with one another. In fact, we find that constantly in our news, what's affecting you and I today deals with the very things that are going on in this Torah portion. The problems, the animosity, the battle between Jacob and Esau. And yet when we begin to look at this, we find that it's not a new war, is it? It's not a new battle. But in fact, it's the same thing that was going on in Genesis at the very beginning. It's the battle between the two seed lines. The seed of the woman, the Messiah's line, and the seed of the serpent. And I found that if we're going to properly understand the battle that's taking place in our days, what we see happening, the culmination of this between these two different seed lines, then we got to take a backtrack and we've got to look here at the beginning of when it first started to see what's going on. And I found that if we look just at the lives of Jacob and Esau, we're really missing some of the things that led up to it, aren't we? And in fact, if we backtrack a little further and we begin to look at Isaac and Rebekah, you'll find that you're going to begin to see some understanding that this battle started long before they were physically manifested in the birth of these two sons. How many realize that the spiritual starts happening long before it begins to affect you in the physical? In fact, we can look around in our physical, we see our circumstances, and we may not know how we got here. We have no idea how we got into the hole that we're in, and yet if we'll backtrack and we'll begin to look, there was things long ago that got us to where we are now. This is the harvest. This was the fruit of things that we allowed to be planted long before this. And so I found that if we don't really understand what this battle is about, then we have the potential to be deceived. We won't know how to wage effective warfare if we don't understand exactly how the enemy is planning on attacking. What's his mode of operation? We won't know what's at stake. How many realize the enemy's quite adept and well at the smoke and mirrors tactic? He'll keep you looking over here, focusing on all this, and you'll completely miss that he's plundered your house over here, and you'll have no idea that whole room, it's gone. He's devastated because you've been so busy looking over here, and it was the little petty things, wasn't it? It's the little things that we get so bent out of shape over, and we miss the big picture. And that's exactly what this Torah portion is about. And if no one else gets it, then at least James has got it. Amen. We're going to look at this a little bit further because I believe it's a word for you and I today, because Yahweh wants you to be victorious. Amen. He wants you to be an overcomer. He wants you to be able to win these battles instead of having the footprints on our backside. Now, if you turn with me in your scriptures to Genesis chapter 25, verse 19, we're going to look at the start of this portion. Toldot is translated as generations. And a lot of times, if we're honest, whenever we see these lists of names, it's completely lost on us, isn't it? Because we've removed ourselves from the significance. These names were important in the original language. They declared prophetical declarations over the lines that they're describing. And that's why so often Yahweh takes the time to list the genealogy, to list these names. Well, let's take a look at it here. In 25:19, thankfully it's a short list, isn't it? It's not a long list of names, and we can actually pronounce the majority of these. It says, and these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. And Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister to Laban the Syrian. And Isaac entreated Yahweh for his wife because she was barren. And Yahweh was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And we know that if we read on, it gives us a little bit more details about the labor process of these two sons, the twins in the womb. But before we get there, we're going to look a little bit of what's going on here in this intro. Because immediately we're presented with the conundrum. Immediately we're presented with the problem. And it's not something you're going to see in the English. You're only going to see it in the Hebrew. That's why it's so important that we take the time to take it back to the original language. And the problem here is found in the actual name of this Torah portion. How many remember the name of it? It was Toldot. Well, that name itself begins to present to us a mystery. It's the word, it's translated as generations. And if you have your concordance, it's Strong's number 8435. Toldot is the singular, but it's always used in the plural. Toldot, generations. And it's translated as meaning descendants, results, proceedings, generations, genealogy, a history. But the interesting thing here is that when you begin to look at this scripture in the original Hebrew, you'll find that the word Toldot here in this verse is missing a letter that's found in the original spelling of it. It's missing the second Vav. Originally, Toldot is spelled Tav, Vav, Lamed, Dalet, Vav, Tav. But here, that second Vav, it's dropped. It's missing. Instead, it's spelled Tav, Vav, Lamed, Dalet, Tav. Some of you may be thinking, well, what's the point? What's the significance? So a letter is dropped. It's still pronounced the same way. It's still spelled and comes across the same way. But let's look at this, because whenever Yahweh does something like this, we know that it's not an accident. He didn't just forget the Vav. He didn't just not have enough room quite on the scroll to get that letter so that one can go. There's a significance to this. So let's look a little bit further. The interesting thing is that when we begin to look at this word Toldot, generations, the first time that it's used is in the beginning of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. And we're told in this verse that these are the generations, these are the Toldot of the heavens and of the earth when they were created, in the day that Yahweh Elohim made the earth and the heavens. The interesting thing here, when we begin to see this mystery unfolding, is that here, Toldot has that Vav. It is spelled with all of the letters originally. And yet when you begin to study this word Toldot, you'll find that after Genesis 2, verse 4, every single time Toldot is now used since then. And remember, there's a lot of genealogies listed throughout Genesis after this. The Vav is always strangely missing until this Torah portion and even after this portion. So we have to ask the question, what happened? Where's the Vav? Is it significant that it's no longer there? If we look at Genesis 2:4, when the Vav is still there, we find that it's revealing to us and summing up the history and the proceedings of how Yahweh created heaven and earth. And it's describing the state before the sin of Adam, before the fall, when everything was still uncompromised, when everything was still in its perfect original state. And yet we find that after the fall, after the sin, after they eat of the wrong tree, Toldot, now the spelling becomes differently. It's spelled defectively every time after this. The Vav is removed. The Vav is missing. And so I don't know about you, but when I see something like that, I think, well, my goodness, what's the significance? There's got to be a reason, something that Yahweh is attempting to reveal to us. But we'll never understand unless we know what the Vav represents. Why is the Vav missing? Well, we understand that the Vav It has a numerical value of 6. The interesting thing is this is the 6th Torah portion of the year. In other words, this is the Vav portion. The Vav's missing, but yet this is the 6th portion. So it seems that there's some type of connection that's going on here that we've got to look at. Well, let's look at what this Vav represents. We understand that in the Hebrew, every single letter, it has a corresponding meaning. It's a picture. The Hebrew language is a very pictographic language. We know that the Vav represents the humble man. It represents the nail, the connector, or the hook. Originally, Adam was supposed to represent the Vav. We understand that's why he was created on the 6th day, 6 being the number of man. Adam was the Vav. He was the connector, the hook between Yahweh and his creation. After Adam's fall, the Vav's missing, though. If we continue to look at this letter Vav, if you've ever seen a Torah scroll, the way it's written, you'll know that it's written in columns, isn't it? What you may not have realized, at the beginning of every single column, there's the Hebrew letter Vav written at the beginning of each column on the Torah scroll. And the sages teach that that Vav is there because it's hooking the words to the page. It's connecting the word of Yahweh to that parchment, to that container, if you will. We also understand this Vav, it's a picture of the hook, the connector, the one that joins something together, the humble man. We know that it represents the Messiah. The Messiah was the Vav man, the Torah scroll, the word of Yahweh made flesh. And we know that he would become the connector, wouldn't he, for fallen man, the one that would join us once again. But the interesting thing here is that, remember, the Vav is missing here in this word Toldot. From Genesis 2 forward, we find that it's always pointing towards the fact that the access, the connection's been lost. The joining factor that would connect us to Yahweh, the Vav, is gone. It's gone after Adam compromises the role of the Vav man. He compromises the role of the Messiah. And here we find, as we begin to look into the genealogy of Abraham and Isaac that's listed here, the Vav is still strangely missing. And you're being reminded, now we can begin to understand the significance that when we see that the Vav is missing, remember that the Vav represented your connection. So without the Vav, it's as if you're being reminded that without the Vav, you're cut off. You're outside. Just as Adam was sent outside of the garden, if you don't have the Vav, there's no hope for us. We're cut off. We're strangers to the covenant. We're outside the house. There's no joiner. There's no connector. There's no humble man that's bringing us together. And so we have to look at this a little bit further, because remember, this is the 6th Torah portion. This is the Vav portion. And so it seems to be pointing towards the fact that Isaac and Rebekah, remember, this is about their genealogy now. Abraham has passed on. Abraham has fulfilled his role. And now it's Isaac's turn. And we find that it seems to be pointing towards the fact that Rebekah and Isaac now have an opportunity to once again reinsert the Vav. Do you realize what's at stake here? They now have the opportunity to become the doorway for the Vav again into the earth. Literally the word of Yahweh. And we understand that Isaac and Rebekah, they were about to become the physical predecessors of Yeshua. They were about to become part of the lineage of the line of Messiah, the bloodline. It was their job to continue it. But not only was this about the physical bloodline of Yeshua being continued so that the Vav could be inserted once again, the connector once again joining you together, but it was also about speaking forth the word. Because remember, he's the word made flesh. That Vav, hooking the words to the parchment. So we find that Isaac and Rebekah, it wasn't so much about the physical, but about the spiritual as well. If they weren't able to speak forth the Vav, if they weren't able to insert the Vav that way into their lives, then they would never be able to continue the physical bloodline either. Do you realize that you and I have the same opportunity as well? You've been called to be a doorway for the Vav. You've been called to be a mouthpiece. You've been charged with speaking the Vav forth into the earth, being one that would join and connect again, speaking forth the word of encouragement. You can be a doorway for the Vav. Well, immediately after we look at this, we find that we're presented with another problem, though. We understand Isaac and Rebekah, what they're being tasked with. They're being tasked with, once again, reinserting the Vav, being this one that would join, connect, allowing him to use them as a doorway. And yet the next thing that we're told, we find is that Rebekah is barren. Doesn't that sound familiar? When we go back and look, we find that she seems to be following in the footsteps of the one that was before her, Sarah. And we also know that when we fast forward, it doesn't end here with Rebecca either, does it? But once again, in the next chapter of this lineage, we find that Rachel as well suffers from being barren. If we fast forward later, we find that another very prominent individual, Hannah, suffers from being barren. And we can also see that Israel herself, the bride of Messiah, is prophesied as being one that at one point was barren. And so we see that each of these women, they're functioning as a shadow picture of the bride of Messiah, aren't they? And we find that today, all of us who are representing this bride as well, could we as well be put into this same category, one that's been barren? Do you realize we've all been given a promise? You've been given a task. You've been charged with being one that would speak forth the word, being one that would be the vav, the doorway for the vav into the earth. But just like each of these women, we find that it seems there's something that's hindering that promise. There's something that's stopping it up. We've got a little trickle, we've got a little bit of it, but it's not fully flowing at the rate that it should be. Do you realize this book is full of promises that are for the rightful heirs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and yet how much do we walk in these promises? There's something that's hindering it. I don't know about you, but whatever it is, I'd like to know what it is. Are you ready? You could sound a little bit more excited. That might be our first problem now. We really don't care. Now let's look at this a little bit closer. Let's look at this word generations. We've already looked at it. We know there's a missing vav here, but let's look a little bit closer. The word generations, as we've already said, it's toldot. And it means descendants, results, proceedings. Generations or genealogies, a history. Well, let's look at the root of this word. It comes from the root yalad. Can you say that with me? Yalad. It means to bear, to bring forth, to beget, to gender, to travail. But it can also mean to cause or to help bring forth. In other words, he's about to reveal something, I believe, that can help remove the hindrances, that can help remove the obstacles that we've been facing when it comes to his promises being made effect in your life. He's about to reveal something that's going to help the birthing process along. Some of you women probably can understand this, having been through childbirth. If something's going to help this along, it's probably very welcome, isn't it? You're ready to get it over with. And we find that the same thing is being told here to Isaac and Rebekah. There's something that's going to help this along. Something's been hindering the promises in the house, but he's about to reveal. There's a way that the hindrances can be removed. We find that it can also mean to declare one's birth or pedigree. This is something that's kind of lost on us today because the inheritance is a little different today. The passing on of the family name, it really doesn't have the meaning that it did back then in ancient Israel. We find that to declare your pedigree meant that not only were you declaring and proving whose house you belonged to, whether it was your tribe or your kin, but that when you declared this was your pedigree, this was your house, you were doing that because you were claiming your inheritance. You were letting them know, this is my inheritance. These are my promises, my rightful inheritance that's about to be passed down to me. And so now we can begin to understand that if we're going to declare that we belong in the house of Yahweh, and we can prove this is our heritage, this is our pedigree, and we're willing to speak forth the Vav man, then you're declaring that all these promises that are right here, this covenant, then that belongs to me. That's my rightful inheritance. And that means anyone that's been trying to hinder me from getting it better look out, right? Anyone that's been hindering me from gaining access to the things that my Father promised me is going to be in trouble. Now let's look a little bit further. This word toldot, if we break it apart, it has the ta prefix. That ta prefix means you will, she will, or they will. It infers a future fulfillment of this. In other words, it's your clue right here that this isn't just speaking about Rebekah and Isaac, but it has a future prophetic significance. It could just as well be speaking to you. You will then do whatever this top's connected to. It's connected to the lamed. We find that the lamed prefix can mean to go towards something, to it. Something that would goad you into action. How many of you know a lot of times we need to be goaded into action? Sometimes we get lazy. We get lackadaisical. We get comfortable with what we've got, and we really don't put forth the initiative to claim these promises and do what it takes to keep it. And so the Lamed comes along to goad us into action, to let us know that we need to wake up, pay attention. This is connected to the Dalet Tav on the end of this word, Toldot. The Dalet Tav forms the word meaning a law or an edict. It's the dot, the Torah, the laws of Yahweh. And so when we place this word together, Toldot, we find that it becomes a very powerful prophetic declaration that's not only affecting the lives of Rebekah and Isaac, but it's affecting their lineage all throughout the years after that, all the way until today. This declaration is still ringing forth over you and I as well. It was declaring that she will bear, she will bring forth. But remember that Tav can also mean you will bring forth, you will bear fruit. And we find that he then goes on to describe exactly how you're going to do this. It's by declaring the pedigree. It's by declaring the promises of Yahweh in your circumstances and in your life. It's by declaring whose house you belong in, by your actions, by the words that you speak, making it known that you belong in this house, in the house of Yahweh. And we find that by being goaded towards his laws, by being unctioned, by being one that would walk in his edicts, in his commandments, and in his Torah, that this is how Rebekah would bear fruit. This is how you and I, today as the bride of Messiah, would bear fruit, would bring forth the harvest. We find that if we'll declare the word of Yahweh into our circumstances, declare it forth, this is what he's promised you, that then you'll bear much fruit. And we find that this is then what aids us in removing the hindrances. How many of you have got some hindrances in your life right now? You don't have to raise your hand. I know some of you are scared to make the enemy upset. So you just kind of, a lot of times, don't say that. Don't know that we're thinking about this. And yet you're being right. You're being goaded. You're being prodded. You've got an opportunity to be the victor. You've got an opportunity to be the overcomer. You've got an opportunity to gain access to the promises of his word. And it has to do with you being willing to declare it into your circumstances. It has to do with you being willing to walk it out. No matter what may be going on, no matter what he may attempt to do, no matter what my flesh feels like, whether it's comfortable or not, we're going to walk this out. We're going to declare the promises of Yahweh and know that this is the house that we belong in. Amen? That ought to get some of you excited. Now, it's also interesting to note that as we continue to look at this, we're inspecting this, we're dissecting it. We find that originally our first problem is that the vav's missing, and you've been tasked with speaking forth that vav, becoming a doorway for it, once again inserting it. And we find that the next thing that takes place is that after it says that these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son, there's an interesting thing that happens because it doesn't actually tell you the generations of Isaac from Isaac forward. Instead, it tells us that Abraham begot Isaac. It goes back. It lists his father instead. And remember, we've already established the fact that this has to do with declaring your pedigree, right? Declaring your lineage. And we find this is the first thing that's happening here in this Torah portion. Isaac is declaring his pedigree. He's declaring his lineage. And we find that if Isaac is willing to declare that pedigree, declare this lineage, that he's of the line of Abraham, it's as if he's letting Yahweh and everyone else know. That means that if I'm of the house of Abraham, I'm entitled to all the promises of Abraham. I'm entitled to all the blessings of Abraham. I'm entitled to that same covenant promise that Abraham was given. So let's look at this name, Abraham. Why is it so important that his name be inserted here? In fact, it's repeated. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac is Abraham's son. Let's look at this name, Abraham. And we know that Yahweh changed his name. Yahweh was very instrumental in making sure that Abraham's name was declaring something. Abraham is Strong's number 85. It's translated as meaning father of a multitude or chief of a multitude. And we know that it had to do with the fact that Abraham was promised that he would have a lineage. He would have multiple descendants, that it would be his line that would be the doorway for the Vav man, right? His lineage, the Messiah would come through. Well, let's break down this name a little bit further. It's spelled Aleph, Beit Resh He, Mem. The letter Aleph as a prefix means I will. And we know that Yahweh changed the name of Abraham. And so this could literally be that Yahweh's declaring something. I will And now we've got to look at the rest of his name to find out exactly what proclamation he's making. The Beit Tharash and the Hay is connected to this Aleph. It forms Strong's number 1262, and it can mean to select, to make a covenant with someone, or to assign a task to. You realize that when you begin to walk in covenant with Yahweh, it's not that now you don't have to do anything. You made a decision and now that's it. That's the end of it, which is what a lot of times we have a tendency to think, that once we make this declaration, that's it. That's the end of it. Now it's all smooth sailing. But this word, it can also mean to assign a task to. When you enter into covenant and you begin to walk this out with Yahweh, you've been assigned a task now. There's some work that's going to be involved in this. A covenant's two parts. Each one has a job, a task to do. This is attached to the letter Mem. The letter Mem, we know it represents a womb, a vessel for the seed. But it's interesting because when you look at the way the Mem is written in the Hebrew language, it's constructed with the letter Kaf, which means to possess something. It's the hand, to have it in your hand. And it's connected to the Vav, the letter Vav. That makes the letter Mem. The letter Vav we've already looked at. We understand this is about reinserting the Vav, right? Being a doorway for the Vav. Being a doorway for his word to once again be in the earth. So this letter Mem could literally infer to be a womb, a vessel that possesses the Vav. The one that has the letter Vav. So when we see Abraham's name listed here, it's reminding us of the declaration that Yahweh himself has made over this lineage, over Abraham, over Isaac, and over the rest of the house that you're now a part of. I will select them, Abraham's household, and assign them with the task of wombing my word, becoming the womb for my seed. It was talking about the line of Messiah, but it was also talking about the Torah, the covenant promises as well. They were meant to possess and contain the Vav. Well, do you realize if we're not willing to contain it in this form, if we're not willing to handle the Vav in its written form, the Torah, then you'll never be able to handle him in the form of the Messiah. They're one and the same. You can't separate one from the other. He's the Word made flesh. And so if we disdain this and we don't want anything to do with this, we don't want to handle this, then you're showing your indication that you don't want to handle him. You don't want to be a vessel for him. And we find that when Abraham's name is listed here, that was the reminder. When was the last time you put Yahweh in remembrance of some declarations that he made in your life? Isaac was putting him in remembrance. I'm of the household of Abraham. All of these covenant promises now belong to me. You promised. You gave us a task. We're to womb the Vav. We're to be a vessel for your word. And yet we find that it's after this declaration that in the very next verse we're told that Rebekah's barren. And so once again, it seems there's a problem here. This has been declared, this has been promised, but something's hindering it. There's some disconnect somewhere. The Vav isn't being made manifest. The promises aren't bearing fruit yet. They may have been declared in the spiritual, but nothing's changed in the physical, or so it seems. How many of you happen to be in that type of situation? You know it's been declared in the spiritual. You know the promises, but when you look around, it seems as if there's a disconnect. It seems as if it hasn't really been made manifest. And we can get weary, and we can get tired, and sometimes we can get lazy and lackadaisical, and we stop proclaiming it. Well, let's look a little bit further, because this is for you. This portion is about where we are today. Let's look once again at that value of 6. Because it's in this number 6 that we find the clues. 6 is the value or the gematria of the Hebrew word bod, Strong's number 905. It's translated as meaning alone, by itself, a separation, something that's separated, and it comes from the root meaning to withdraw from something, to be separated or isolated from it, to disjoin, to divide. It has the notion of cutting or tearing apart. Isn't that interesting? Because it's the exact opposite of what the letter Vav itself means. To join something together, to connect it, a peg, a nail, a hook. But now we have this word which means to disconnect, to disjoin something, to isolate it, to divide it, to cut and tear it apart. We find these terms, they're cognate of another word in the Hebrew spelled the same way with this Beit Dalet, and it means empty talk, idle talk, a liar, to lie. It's from the word bada, which means to devise or contrive, to invent, to form or to fashion. And this word is used of how a potter would fashion clay. Isn't that interesting? Because it's connected to this word dealing with your words, idle talk, empty talk. Do you realize that our words, good or bad, will fashion and form our circumstances? Our words will fashion and form ourselves. They will fashion and form those around us, our household, anyone that we come in contact with. Our words are like a potter, and these situations are like clay. Your words are dictating what you have. Your words are fashioning your circumstances. And we find that this begins, it's seeming that it's giving us some insight into why Rebekah is barren. It seems that when we withdraw, when we separate ourselves, when we become disjoined from his word, from these promises that he's given us, it then opens us up for idle words. It opens us up for empty talk, for things that have no promise, words that have no value, then to fashion, to form, and to dictate our circumstances. And we find that it's these idle words, these empty words that have no merit in them, that then begin to effectively cut off and hinder the word of Yahweh in our lives. And we don't bear fruit because something else came in and cut off that original seed. Something else came in and cut off the promises, choked them out. In fact, if we begin to look around the body as a whole, the body of Messiah, we see that it does seem as if there's been another word that's been dictating and shaping and forming our circumstances, doesn't it? It doesn't seem as if we're walking in the fullness, in the image of what the Torah says that we could be. And it seems as if then maybe somewhere along the line something else came in. Another seed got planted. Another word was introduced and we didn't cut it off. And now we find that it's strangled out the promises in our own lives. It's begun to fashion and form us. Let's look at the word barren. They were told that Rebekah is barren. It's the same word describing Sarah, the same word describing Rebekah, the same word describing Rachel, Hannah, the same words used in the book of Isaiah describing Israel. Let's look at this word for barren. It's Strong's number 6135, a car, and it means to be barren or sterile. It's from the root, though, meaning to pluck up, to root up. And it's describing a plant to dig out or to tear down, to destroy. But it doesn't just mean to trim this plant back, to tear off some of its leaves or some of its branches. It means to pluck up by the roots. Now, if any of you have done any gardening, whether it be flowers or vegetables, if you tear something up by the roots, what chance do you got of something else growing back? You don't really got a good chance, do you? The roots are gone. The plant is gone. It's been destroyed. There's nothing left. Let's continue to look at this. It comes from the root. Well, actually, it has the same letters, this term akar, meaning barren. It has the same letters, this ayin kuf resh, as another word in Hebrew. It's Strong's number 6207, arak, and it means to gnaw or to chew. It's used figuratively of pains that would gnaw at you on the inside, chew away at you, something that weakens, tears away at a person, someone's strength being continually worn away by suffering. We find then that this is connected to this word for barren. It seems to be letting us know and describing the fact that this wasn't just a quick assault on the house, was it? It was something that was prolonged. It was a prolonged battle. Do you realize it's in the long battles that we have a tendency to get tired? It's in the long, drawn-out battles that we have a tendency, our strength to be weak, and it chews away at us. It wears you down piece by piece to the point that we just can't fight anymore, and we just give up. And that's what this word barren is inferring. It's a long, drawn-out battle. It's one of those that the enemy likes to wage against you because he's got nothing else to do. And he knows that if it's a continual battle, that eventually you begin to get worn out. You begin to get tired. Your strength begins to wear away. In fact, here in this particular instance, it takes 20 years before there's a birth in the house. A 20-year-long, drawn-out battle, declaring the promises of Yahweh, but seeing nothing materializing in the physical. How long has it been for you? Now let's look at this. We find that it's the idle words. It's the empty talk that constantly wears away and weakens our strength. And we find that if allowed these empty words, this other word, something that's not the word of Yahweh, the seed that's planted by the enemy that bears no fruit, it plucks up by the roots that promised word. It doesn't just cut away some of it. It doesn't just diminish the promise a little bit, but it chooses to tear it up by the roots to the point that you've got nothing left. No promise, no word in you now, because it's been plucked up by the roots. The thing that had originally been deposited into you by Yahweh gets choked out by the idle words. Now think, how often are we putting in the word of Yahweh compared to how often we're putting in and listening or having to be faced with idle, empty words that we know will produce no fruit? And then we can begin to see the way the circumstances begin to play out. We're being fashioned and formed by these words. And if it's only once a week that we've got the good being put in, and it's 6 days a week that we got the other, now we can begin to see, well, we've only got a little bit of a trickle, right? It hasn't really fashioned and formed our circumstances because it's been outweighed by the other. Mark chapter 4 goes into great detail about this. The seed that would be planted by the sower, and all of the battles that would then ensue for the seed that had been sown. Because it just doesn't end with it being planted in good ground, but then you got to watch over it. You've got to water it. You've got to deal with the fowls of the air. There's a lot of issues that then entail this seed being planted. We find that with this same malady affecting quite a few of the women of Israel, my tongue's getting tangled, it looks as if the names of these might be important, because we're specifically told Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Hannah, these were the individuals that were barren. We know that names are prophetic, aren't they? They're important. So I decided, well, let's just go look at these names. Maybe these names have something to do with this whole battle, the fruit not being born, the seed being planted, but being attacked. Let's look a little bit further. In Genesis 11:30, we're told that Sarai is barren. It's before her name's been changed. Her name originally meant princess. It came from the root, though, sarar, which means to rule, to govern, to prevail over, to hold dominion. But it's a cognate of the word. In fact, it's spelled the same way, sheen, resh, resh, as a word that means an enemy, a foe, a slanderer, to twist or twine. How many of you know that's what a lie does? It twists the words. It can have a little bit of truth in it, but then it twists it, just like the serpent did in the garden. It can mean to oppress and to press together. It sounds like those slanderous words that we were talking about earlier that can press and dictate your circumstances, that can fashion and form you. When we look at this name Sarah, we find that it's painting us a picture of the one that was meant to prevail, the one that's meant to be the overcomer, the one that should be having dominion as the bride. And yet we find that if there's these other words that are allowed to come in, the twisted words, the words that oppress, the ones that press together, then we begin to have some issues in the house. Let's look at Rebecca. Rebecca, we're told in Genesis 25:21 that she is now barren. Her name is translated as meaning an ensnarer, and it can either refer to a rope with a noose. Sounds like quite an interesting name to name your daughter. But it can actually infer one that would ensnare with her beauty. But if you begin to look at the roots of this name, there's a lot more to the name Rebecca than meets the eye. The roots of her name come from a verb that means a tying up of cattle. But we have to understand the background. The cattle were tied up both for their own protection, the establishment of their home, and to keep them from wandering off. So when we see this name Rebecca and it's inferring something that's been tied up and put into boundaries, it's actually painting the same picture of what the Torah does. The covenant, this is your boundary lines. This is what dictates how you're to establish your home. It's for your own protection. It's to keep you from wandering off and going way over there where you've got no business being. So we find that this name Rebecca is inferring one that has the boundary lines intact, one that is keeping the Torah in such a way so that her home can be established for her own protection, to keep her from wandering off. And so we're reminded as we're looking at these names that as long as you're in the boundary lines, as long as you're keeping this word, this is what you're declaring, this is what house you're choosing to be established in, then you can grow, then you can be fruitful, then your house can be established. Let's look at Rachel. In Genesis 29:31, we're told Rachel is now barren. It doesn't seem like such a surprise at this point, does it? Rachel in Hebrew is translated as meaning ewe, as a female sheep. But it comes, when you break apart our name, we have the Resh, the Ket, Lamed. The Ket Lamed forms the root word kol. It means to profane, to make something common, to pollute it. It's the opposite of kadosh, something that's holy and set apart. It's attached to the letter Resh. The letter Resh represents the head, the chief one, the Messiah. In other words, when we see this name Rachel, it's describing some characteristics of this bride. The one that is supposed to be being the doorway for the Vav, the doorway for his word in the earth. And it's describing that we have a tendency at times to defile, to pollute, to profane our head, to profane the Messiah, when we allow these slanderous, idle, empty words to come in the house. And finally, in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 5, we're told that Hannah is also barren. Hannah in Hebrew is chana, and it means grace or favor. It's the same roots that can be found in the name Noah, but they're swapped backwards. We understand that favor, grace, is granted by Yahweh due to your obedience to the Torah. Noah finds grace in the eyes of Yahweh because he was obedient to do what Yahweh had told him to do. It's different than mercy. The same letters of the form Hannah, chana, can also form the word meaning to lay siege against, a pitched battle that's taking place. So now let's connect these names together. These are the 4 women that we're specifically told in the scriptures they're barren. By connecting these names, we find that they declare that the bride who's been given the promised word, because each of these women, weren't they given a promised word before we're told they were barren? Each of them was promised that they would birth. Each of them was promised they would be fruitful. Each of them was promised that they would be a doorway for the Vav. So we find that each of them has been given the promised word, and we're being told that we have the ability to prevail. We have the ability to have dominion, to rule with our husband, the Messiah, to be that one that would be his helpmate. That's what you've been called to be. You have that potential, but we only have that potential as long as we stay in the boundary lines. Like Adam and Eve. The minute they walk outside the boundary lines, that potential is lost, isn't it? They're no longer the helpmate. They're no longer in his image. It's changed. So we find that as long as we're in the boundary lines for our own protection and for the establishment of our home, in other words, the house can be fruitful. We don't have to be barren if we're in the boundary lines. And yet we find that slanderous words are allowed in the house, that twist, that manipulate, that attempt to oppress, and they begin to dictate our circumstances to us instead of the word of Yahweh. And we become one that defiles, pollutes, and profanes our husband instead of one that's his crown of glory. So now we can begin to understand this battle. Remember, we started talking at the beginning about Jacob and Esau. It's the battle about Jacob and Esau. But yet when we backtrack, we find that they're just players in the same game. It's taking you all the way back to the beginning of Genesis. It's about the 2 seed lines, the 2 words, the word and the seed of the serpent versus the promised word of Yahweh. And we find that this battle is about you being weighed in the balance, and you're being determined, and you're being seen that, are you going to receive grace in his eyes? Will you be seen as one that's obedient, one that stayed in the boundary lines, one that's keeping the Vav word in your life, one that's willing to declare it to be that doorway, or are we one that allows the enemy to lay siege against it and we lose the Vav? Remember, the Vav is strangely missing after the fall of Adam. And so we find that what's at stake is, will you keep the word, make sure it's productive, fruitful in your life, or will you allow the Vav to strangely disappear? Will the Vav become unhooked? Will you be disjoined, torn apart, separated from his word, and instead be left with nothing but empty, idle words that cause the house to be barren, that bring forth no fruit? Mark chapter 4, verse 17 tells us that the whole reason you're going to be going through this battle is because it's for the word's sake. You realize it doesn't have to do about you. It has to do with what's inside of you, the word of Yahweh. That's what the enemy comes after. It says when affliction or persecution arises, it's for the word's sake. That's why the minute you began to get in this and you started trying to put in this word, it seems like all hell broke loose, didn't it? It was easier before you started doing this. And the reason is because now you got something he wants. Now you've actually got something of value. It's the word's sake that the reason the enemy begins to attack. And we find that you're being prepared, that there's a battle that's going to ensue, but you are more than an overcomer. That name Sarah reminds you, you can prevail. You can have dominion. He doesn't have to dictate your circumstances to you. We find that this problem is overcome when Isaac entreated Yahweh. Let's look at this word, entreated. Because some of us, maybe you're going through the same type of battle. Maybe it's been quite a while and it seems as if the promises have been cut off. But just like Isaac, we have the potential, we have the ability to entreat Yahweh on behalf of us. The word entreated in Hebrew, it's athar. It means to pray, to entreat, to supplicate, to burn incense. And we understand that the prayers of Israel rose up like the incense in the tabernacle. It comes from the root meaning to be abundant, to be multiplied, to be larger, to make more numerous, and to do often. In other words, Isaac prayed and entreated Yahweh often, abundantly. His prayers were made more numerous. They were multiplied. We have a tendency that at the beginning, they're numerous, they're multiplied, but then as the weeks and the months and the years go on, they become less and less and less because it seems as, well, he's not even listening anyway. And so we don't put forth the effort. And we need that lamet, we need that goad to goad us a little bit more. And so it seems as if it has to do with you asking, with you entreating, going before Yahweh. But let's look a little bit closer at this word to see what else it entails. Because a lot of us, we've got that down pat, right? We know how to ask. I won't, I won't, I won't. I need, I need, I need. I got to have it. But what else does this word entail? If you break apart this word, athar, meaning to entreat, it's spelled ayin tav resh. The ayin means to see, to understand, to discern, to look at something. The tav resh forms the two-letter root of the word tor. Strong's number 8446. It means to seek out, to explore, to search out, to spy out. It's the same root of the word Torah. The only difference is a hey has been added to the end of it. In other words, in connection with entreating Yahweh, with asking, with offering up his prayers, he also often searched out, sought out, went to the Torah for understanding in order for the promises of Yahweh to be made manifest in his life. And here we find this might be where the disconnect is just a little. We'll ask, we'll entreat, but how often are we going to the Torah, searching, discerning, looking for the answers, looking for those promises that are rightfully ours and choosing to stand on it? Because it's both. And notice that it's not just once in a blue moon, is it? It's not just every Saturday when I come and I hear someone else do it. It's not just when I'm in the midst of the battle and it's really bad right now, and so I'm going to go and I'm going to look for a key verse to spout off. But that word means to do continually, to be numerous, for it to be multiplied, to constantly be searching, discerning, looking, putting it in, making sure that you're connected to the Vav, making sure you're not disjoined, because it's when we're disjoined that the house becomes barren. Now let's look a little bit further. The same letters that spell this word athar, entreated, form the word terah, just a different order. Same letters though. This word means a door or a court. It signifies the court of the king. How many of you realize that whenever you're praying and you're offering up this incense and you're bringing forth these petitions, you're bringing it to the court of the great king? Well, do you know that there's a proper protocol when you become before the court of the great king? You don't get to go in there like a spoiled child pitching a fit, do we? There's a certain way that he expects us to come before him, to bring this incense, to bring these prayers so that we're recognized, so the great king will allow you access in. Well, let's look at this word for. It says, Isaac entreated Yahweh for his wife. The word for is nokah. It means to be in front of, in sight, to be before. It's used metaphorically of being before the eyes of Yahweh, literally in front of your face. So we find that this is dealing with the fact that Isaac is constantly in the eyes of Yahweh, constantly before his face with this entreaty, with this prayer, with this incense, bringing this issue of his house before the eyes of Yahweh. You realize that it's not before the eyes of your neighbors. It's not before all these others. It's not about complaining, mumbling and groaning and spreading it around the camp, but he was taking it to the one that could actually do something about it. before the eyes of Yahweh, bringing it to the great king, the one that he knows if he rules in his favor, then the problem is solved. Well, let's look a little bit further. This word, Nakoa, it's a cognate of Strong's number 5228 that means straight, right, straightness. It's used to describe a legal case as straightforward, obviously one that's deserving of amends. In other words, Isaac's been done wrong in this case, and he has a case that if he can bring it before the great king, he knows that it's deserving of amends. He knows the great king is going to act on his behalf. Why? Because he knows the promises. He knows that he can declare his pedigree. He knows that he's supposed to be the doorway for the Vav. So we find that Isaac has come into the court of the king in order to bring this issue in the face of Yahweh. He's come to plead his case, and because he's able to declare his pedigree, because he's able to prove that he's been one that was willing to walk in covenant, walk in the promises, declare it in his life, then he's able to show that his case is deserving of amends. You realize if you go before the court of the great king and he begins to pull up your record and all it's showing is that you've been complaining, mumbling, and grumbling, that you haven't been walking out the Torah, you haven't been declaring those promises, do you really think your case is worthy of amends? Probably he's going to say, you really haven't learned your lesson yet. Take another trip around that mountain. And so yet we find that Isaac, to bring the incense, to bring the prayers, to be one that would search the Torah, regard it, look at it, discern it, declare those promises, understanding that it was his right, declare your pedigree, then your case is worthy of amends. This becomes the pattern for you and I today. We're being reminded that when your authority is being contested, and it seems the house is being plundered, all the promises that are rightfully yours and they're being stolen and you're being stripped of that, you're being reminded that if you're willing and able to declare forth that word, if you're willing and able to declare forth your pedigree and show that you're willing to walk in covenant in the good times and the bad times, then you have a right to come into the court of the great king. You have a right to bring your case before him, and you have a right to know that your case is deserving of amends because you're supposed to be a doorway for the Vav. You're supposed to be a doorway for his word in the earth. And if we're willing to search out his Torah, if we're willing to understand it, then Yahweh's faithful to hear those cries, to hear those prayers, to receive that incense. Now let's look at this fruit that's born from this. Jacob and Esau. And we're going to look at their names and what's taking place when they're in the womb. Now with this as our mindset, this is our understanding. We know what the battle's been about. We know that there's been a very big debate about that word being planted. Well, let's look a little bit further. In Genesis 25:22 through 23, we're told that, and the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of Yahweh. Once again, notice the pattern. Who does she go to? She goes to Yahweh. She goes to the one that can give her the answers, the one that can change the situation. It says, and Yahweh said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. Let's look at this word struggled. They struggled together within her. The word struggled in Hebrew is ritzatz. It means to crush, to oppress, to be broken. It's not just a little tug of war, but as you can see, remember, this is a very important battle. This is about the 2 seed lines, the 2 words, the door for the Vav. But the interesting thing is that this word has a gematria, or numerical value of 380. It's the same as the word lashon, which means tongue, language, the instrument of speech. Well, isn't that funny? Because isn't that what the battle's about? The tongue, the lashon, the instrument of speech. What word was planted in you? What word you're going to be a vessel for? Let's look at the word separated. We're told that they'll be separated once they come out from her bowels. 2 manner of people would be separated. The word separated here is parad, and it means to separate, to divide. It's the same word that's used, though, to describe how after the flood of Noah, the descendants were separated after their tongue, after their lashon in Genesis 10:5. They were parad. They were separated based on their language. It's interesting because the language of Yahweh, the Hebrew tongue, goes hand in hand with being one that would keep covenant, being one that would walk in this covenant. It was an indicator. It was a factor that would recognize you as whose house you belong to, depending on what language you speak. If we look at this, we find that their tongues, what their tongues spoke, made the distinction, whether it spoke a word from the flesh or a word from a circumcised heart. Luke chapter 6, verse 45 tells us, for out of the abundance of the heart, his mouth speaks. Now you can understand why this lashon, this tongue, is so important, because it's an indicator of what's on the inside. This lashon will reveal what seed, what word was planted inside of you. It will reveal whether you're choosing to birth an Esau or to birth a Jacob. It will reveal whether you planted the good seed and you're going to bear much fruit, or whether you're one that's allowed the empty idle words to come in and take root. We have to ask the question, could this be the spiritual implication behind these two, Jacob and Esau? Esau becomes the manifestation of the idle words, the empty talk, the lies that attempt to cut off the promised word of Yahweh, where Jacob represents the promise, the covenant, the Torah. They're divided and separated based upon the words that were spoken forth and received, and this becomes a startling picture, a physical picture of what happens when we allow another word, another seed to be planted in our lives, the seed of the serpent. When we've been given a promised word from Yahweh, both end up bearing fruit if they're not dealt with. Let me ask you a question. What's the ratio of Esau's to Jacob's that we've been birthing in our own lives? They're based upon what word we allowed to be planted. How many Esau's have we raised up and allowed to go running around compared to how many Jacob's? How many promised words have we been bearing the fruit of compared to how many idle words, empty words? Both will begin to bear, but one's going to attempt to cut off the other one. Let's take a closer look at these names of these two twins, because remember, names are prophetic. Esau. And the interesting thing, by the way, is that both of these names, when you begin to study the scriptures, you'll find that especially when you're given the details of the birth of an individual, usually that name is reflecting what was taking place. If you look at the names of Jacob's sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, you'll find that there's always a statement made, and then their name somehow reflects that statement. Reuben, behold a son. He's the firstborn. He was the first son. Simeon, Yahweh has heard me. Leah declares, so she names him Simeon, to hear. But let's look at these names, Esau and Jacob, because you'll find that even though details are given describing them, their names somehow don't reflect those exact details. Such as Esau, we're told that he's red and he's hairy, and his nicknames come from that: Edom, Seir, but Esau doesn't mean neither of those things. Esau, it's translated as meaning hairy, but yet it has nowhere near close to the root of the word hair in Hebrew. Instead, it's said to come from the root asah, which means to do, to fashion, to accomplish, to make. It can infer how one handles something. It can mean to press or to squeeze. Remember those words that have the potential to form, like a potter forms the clay. It presses, it squeezes, it forms. If you break apart his name, you'll find that it's spelled Ayin, Sheen, Vav. The Ayin, Sheen forms the root forming the word meaning moth. It's an insect that's noted in the scriptures for its destructive properties. One who can consume and destroy houses of earth or clay, which represents the flesh. And we see this in the book of Job. It's describing the moth who would destroy those that were in the houses of clay, the fleshly earthen bodies. And we find that this root, this moth, the one that would destroy, is attached to the letter Vav. Well, haven't we been talking about this whole time? The Vav representing the word of Yahweh, the promised word, the thing that should be planted in your life. And we find out this name Esau, it becomes quite a prophetic picture, doesn't it? Because it's reminding you that not only does this other word that we have a tendency to let in our lives, that we allow to be spoken over us and begin to form and dictate our circumstances, that not only will it bear fruit, not only will it cause something to happen in our life, but it will continue to press and to squeeze, to consume and destroy the Vav, the word of Yahweh in our lives. You realize a lot of times we have a tendency to think that when we have tares and weeds that we've sown in our lives, we've allowed that to be planted, that magically it's just going to go away, right? We do all these things and we allow these things to be planted, but they're not really going to affect us on down the road. It's just about the here and now. Once we get past this, that's it. There's nothing else that happens. And yet we're reminded that's going to bear fruit. It's going to affect you later. There's going to be a harvest off of those weed seeds. There's going to be the tendency for those weed seeds to choke out the good seed. Just like this name Esau declares, to handle, to destroy, to consume the Vav, to attempt to pluck out that promised word that was also planted in your life. Now let's look at the name Jacob. Jacob in Hebrew is translated as Yaakov, and it's translated as meaning a supplanter, a heel catcher. But we know that this idea of the one that supplants is only attached to him from Esau later. If you continue to look at the roots of his name, it can mean to circumvent, to supplant, to take by the heel, to follow at the heel, and it can infer one's footsteps or lifestyle. In other words, the name Jacob is dealing with a specific type of lifestyle, his footsteps, the way he lives. It's a cognate of the word akev, Strong's number 6119, which means heel. And the interesting thing is this word is first used in Genesis 3:15. It's a very familiar passage. It's a declaration from Yahweh concerning the two seed lines. He says, "And I will put enmity between thee and this woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel," his akev. And so we find that when Jacob is named Jacob, it was a direct reminder of what this whole battle was about. It was the battle between the two seed lines, the two words that had been spoken in to this household. And we find that it was Jacob who would be the door for the Vav, the door for the Messiah, because of his footsteps, because of his lifestyle, because he was one that would walk in covenant. He was one that would be a container for the Vav. Let's look at this word for bruise. We're told that in this battle, they would attempt to bruise one another. The word bruise is shuf in Hebrew, and it means to bruise or to crush, but it's interesting because it contains the same two-letter root that sheen pei as the word safa, which means lips, language, speech. In other words, it was by proclaiming the word of Yahweh that you would be able to bruise the head of the serpent. It was a reminder that if Isaac and Rebekah, if Jacob, if you and I were willing to declare forth the word of Yahweh, if you were willing to be the doorway for the Vav man in the earth, that's how you would win the battle. It was all about the words that you would speak, the footsteps that you would take, your lifestyle, your words declaring you'll have whatever you say. Now you can understand why the tongue is such a powerful member of the body. Life or death's in the tongue because it has the potential to either bruise the head of the serpent or allow more tares, more weeds to be planted and choke out that promised word. In fact, we're told in Isaiah chapter 55, verse 11, we're going to close with this. We're told, "So shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereto I sent it." That word void, describing how the word of Yahweh would not return unto him void, it's the word rekam, and it means vain, empty, without effect, to no purpose, without a cause. His word will not return to him without a cause, without doing what it was purposed to do, without affecting your situation. But the interesting thing is that it has the kuf mem root. It's the same root as the word kum, meaning to rise up, to stand up. It's the word that's used in Numbers chapter 10, verse 35. When Moshe makes the declaration, "And it came to pass when the ark set forward that Moses said, Rise up, O Yahweh, kum, and let thine enemies be scattered, and let them that hate thee flee before thee." Wouldn't you like to know that when you make a declaration like that Yahweh Sabaoth, the great king, would be the one that's rising up and defeating the enemies, vanquishing those that would attempt to keep the house in bondage, barren, and that you could produce, you could bear fruit because you could declare your pedigree. You could declare the word of Yahweh in your situation. Amen? Amen. I am done.